In our last series, we traced the rise of Germany through Bismarck and Wilhelm II, and then the fall of Austria through Franz Joseph. Both began in the shadow of Napoleon and the revolutions of 1848, moments of reset when Europe tried to build a new order. But the Ottomans had no such reset. Their decline began earlier, their struggles deeper, and their unraveling longer. Where those stories unfolded over decades, this one spans more than a century of struggle. This will be our most ambitious journey yet. From the Tanzimat reforms to the empire's final collapse in the First World War, and to begin, we must start not with victory or renewal, but with survival, with a young prince hidden in the palace baths, while his dynasty tore itself apart. Welcome back to Road to Destruction, the World Wars. In our last episode, we left Franz Josef's Europe on the brink, an old emperor welcoming the war he could not win, and turned east toward an empire that would not choose its fate so much as lose it. Not in a single moment, but over a century. Not through conquest, but through reform. Today we begin with a boy who was never meant to rule and who lived because he learned to hide. Mahmud was born in 1785, a prince of a palace that had forgotten the difference between ceremony and power. The Ottoman Empire still stretched over deserts and seas, over valleys and islands, and the crowded avenues of its capital, but its core was trembling. Armies lost wars they once expected to win. Admirals watched fleets turn to iron-stained skeletons. Ministers signed treaties whose every clause whispered humiliation and invitation to the great powers of Europe to extend their influence. And within the walls of Topkapi, the dynasty that had built this world lived in fear of itself, especially if you were born as a possible heir to the throne. For centuries, Ottoman succession was soaked in blood. Mehmed the Conqueror himself had written the law. Whichever son gained the throne, he could lawfully kill his brothers for the sake of order. It was brutal, but accepted as the price of stability. By the late 18th century, the empire had softened the practice. Princes were no longer strangled outright. Instead, they were confined to the palace, living in the cafes, the cage, cut off from power but kept alive as insurance, a shift from execution to containment. And it was into this fragile world that Mahmud was born. Mahmud's childhood was shaped by silence. He learned to be quiet, to listen, to exist as a possibility rather than a person. Tutors taught him poetry, calligraphy, the verses of confidence from another age, even as the empire outside no longer matched the songs. When Mahmud was still a child, his cousin Selim III came to the throne with a different vision. Selim believed the empire could be saved by changing it. The Nizam-ul-Jadid, the new order, would rebuild the army along European lines. A new treasury would fund it. New schools would train officers who could read both maps and balance sheets. Reform as rescue, law and drill and debt all at once. It was hope. But hope made enemies. The Janissaries, once terrors of Europe, had become a class. Guildsmen, shopkeepers, power brokers in uniforms that remembered victories their wearers no longer earned. Bureaucrats protected their rents. Provincial notables, ayan, guarded their autonomy like miniature kings. The ulama preached against foreign fashions and ideas. To reform the empire, Selim had to take something from all of them. And in 1807 they struck back. What began as mutiny in the barracks spread to the streets. Preachers roused crowds, officers defected. A man named Kabakçı Mustafa became the face of a revolt that didn't just reject new drills or uniforms. It rejected the very idea that the empire should become anything other than what it had been. Selim was forced from his throne. The rebels crowned a new sultan, Mahmud's older brother, Mustafa IV. The new court praised paralysis as prudence, while the men who had broken the new order promised the old one would carry them safely through a world that no longer respected it. But thrones acquired in riots need blood to stay standing. To make his rule permanent, Mustafa IV returned to the long shadow of Ottoman custom. He ordered the murders of Selim III and of his younger brother, Mahmud. End the line of reformers. End the line of rivals. End the question of who might one day sit where he now sat. And there, with cords in the palace and soldiers at the door, our story pauses. The Ottomans had been declining for a century already, and Mahmud's childhood was spent inside that decline. We saw how his cousin Selim III tried to rescue the empire with reform, only to be overthrown by the Janissaries, and how the throne passed to Mahmud's brother, Mustafa IV, a sultan whose caution masked fear and whose power rested on blood. That fear now comes for Mahmud himself. As the palace turns murderous, the baths become a hiding place, and the empire's future narrows to a single prince who refuses to be found. This is road to destruction, the world wars. The palace was never quiet in Istanbul, not even in the dead of night. There was always the sound of boots on stone, of the call to prayer echoing over the Bosphorus, of whispers that carried farther than anyone intended. But in the spring of 1807, the noise became something else entirely. The sound of rebellion inside the walls that had once been the heart of an empire. Janissaries, once the empire's sword, had turned themselves into its jailers. Selim III, the cousin who had tried to reform the army, to reform the state itself, found his throne taken from him. And into the vacuum stepped another figure, not a reformer but a placeholder, Mustafa IV, raised up by the men who thought that if they could not command the empire, at least they could command its ruler. At first, Mustafa was content to wear the crown as they demanded, cautious, pliant, willing to be the sultan in name, while the Janissaries congratulated themselves for defending tradition. But a throne won in rebellion is never steady. Mustafa knew that as long as Selim lived, as long as Mahmud lived, his claim was provisional. The palace corridors were lined with reminders of what succession had once meant. For centuries, the empire had lived with a law so harsh it had become a kind of logic. The ruler must kill his brothers, not for cruelty's sake, but for order. Fratricide was not scandalous. It was stability, like when Mehmed III executed 19 brothers in 1595. Mehmed the Conqueror himself had written the principle into law. By Mustafa's time, the practice had softened into confinement, into the cage, princes locked away but left alive, yet the fear remained. And when fear sits on a throne, it easily turns back into blood. So Mustafa gave the order. 2 rivals, 2 threats, 2 men whose very existence made his reign fragile. Selim and Mahmud must die. Selim was first. He was taken from his rooms, the same rooms where he had once composed music and written poetry, in the hope that reform could be as graceful as art. There was no trial, no chance to protest. Only the cords, the silent weapon of the palace. He was strangled, and with him the vision of a new order. The men who killed him did not only end a life, they ended a possibility, one last chance that the empire might change itself before others forced change upon it. Mahmud was next. He was younger, less formed, a prince who had lived more in the shadows than in the council chambers. But that made him no less dangerous to a man who sat uneasily on the throne. Soldiers poured into the palace, searching the corridors and courtyards, every corner where a frightened heir might hide. And yet, in the chaos, there was a pause. A mother's intervention, a servant's deception, perhaps only the hesitation of men who were not as thorough as they should have been. Mahmud slipped out of sight. The story that survives is one told in whispers, embroidered by time, but grounded in the terror of that night. They say his mother took him by the hand. They say she pushed him behind the walls of the baths, into the steam and marble, into shadows that blurred a prince into nothing more than vapor. Guards swept through the palace, opening doors, turning over cushions, demanding to know where the last of Selim's line had gone. But they did not think to search too closely where the air itself was thick and wet. Mahmud learned to be silent, to breathe as though the very act of making a sound could betray him. For hours the empire believed he was dead. Mustafa believed he had done what sultans once were expected to do: remove all rivals, secure his reign with blood. And for hours Mahmud was not a prince, not even a man, but a shadow behind stone, a survivor who could only wait for the footsteps to pass, surrounded by the sound of dripping water and the heat of the steam. But survival does not last forever in hiding. Events beyond the palace walls were already moving. From the Danube came news of Alemdar Mustafa Pasha, a provincial strongman whose power rested not on tradition, but on soldiers loyal to his command. He had marched toward the capital intending to restore Selim III, to place the reformer back on the throne. His banners and cannon made the Janissaries uneasy. His resolve made Mustafa IV uneasy too. The city, always quick to sense weakness, began to whisper again. Perhaps the rebellion had not secured the empire after all. When Alemdar arrived, it was too late for Selim. The reforming sultan lay strangled, another victim of the cords that had preserved order by destroying it. But it was not too late for Mahmud. Out from the baths, out from the shadows, the young prince emerged, the last thread of legitimacy left in a palace that had nearly severed them all. Alemdar found him, shielded him, and with the authority of armed men at his back, declared that the empire still had a future, if only because it still had a ruler. On July 28, 1808, Mahmud II was enthroned. The ceremony had the trappings of triumph, but everyone present knew it was really an act of salvage. A dynasty that had nearly murdered itself into extinction now presented a survivor as its sovereign. The Janissaries watched, uneasy at the man they had tried to erase. The court adjusted its robes and bowed, as though the chaos of the last months had been nothing but a passing storm. And Mahmud, 23 years old, stepped into a role he had never been raised to expect, but had been forced to accept. His reign did not begin with glory, nor with celebration, nor with the victories that once made the House of Osman a terror from the Danube to the Nile. It began in blood, in fear, in the echo of a mother's hurried breath and the memory of a cousin's strangled body. He was a sultan, not because the empire chose him, not because destiny favored him, but because he survived where others did not. And survival, in the Ottoman world of the 19th century, would prove to be the rarest and most necessary skill of all. But survival alone would never be enough to save an empire. Mahmud's perseverance had turned accident into destiny. Hidden in the baths, shielded by his mother, spared by chance and timing, he emerged not as a prince in waiting, but as the only heir left standing. And when Alemdar Mustafa Pasha forced the gates and demanded a ruler, the boy who had learned to hide was crowned sultan. But a crown does not grant power, and survival is not the same as rule. The summer of 1808 should have been a moment of restoration. Alemdar Mustafa entered Istanbul with troops at his back, his cannons facing the city, and a vision that reform could yet be saved. Where Selim III had been undone by the Janissaries, Alemdar believed he could contain them by force. The Janissaries had grown fat on privilege, their core swollen with men who no longer trained as soldiers, but lived as tradesmen, shopkeepers, or parasites of the state. They could riot at will, unmake sultans, and dictate policy. If the empire was to survive, Alemdar thought, they had to be curbed. But though Mahmud wore the crown, it was Alemdar who ruled. The young sultan was little more than a witness, as his patron reformed the palace guard, disciplined the capital, and forced the court to bow to his will. To some, it seemed the empire had acquired a second sultan, one in robes, the other in armor. Mahmud's enthronement did not end the bloodletting. His brother, Mustafa IV, who had ordered his death only days earlier, still lived in the palace. To leave him alive was to invite another rebellion, another attempt to place a pliant figure on the throne. Mahmud understood what survival required. Within the week, Mustafa was executed, a rare moment when the cage closed, not in confinement, but in finality. The dynasty that had nearly extinguished itself with fratricide now resorted to it once more, but this time in defense of a single survivor. Yet force makes enemies. By the autumn, the Janissaries had rallied against the provincial pasha who dared to cage them. Whispers spread through the barracks, blades were sharpened, and on November 15th, 1808, they struck. They stormed the Sublime Porte, the very seat of government, and trapped Alemdar inside. Surrounded, he refused to surrender. Instead, he lit the fuse of a powder magazine. The explosion tore through the palace, killing him and hundreds around him, and with him died the last man willing to hold reform at the point of a sword. The city dissolved into chaos. The Janissaries rioted through Istanbul, burning homes, looting shops, punishing anyone suspected of siding with reform. Fires swept through entire quarters and smoke choked the skyline. The message was clear. The Janissaries ruled the streets, and the Sultan who had watched his savior die was powerless to stop them. They had overthrown Selim, killed Alemdar, and seen a Sultan strangled in his own rooms, and yet no punishment fell upon them. Mahmud could not touch them, not yet. Instead, the corps swaggered back into their barracks and markets, their power unbroken, their arrogance greater than ever. They had survived reform, they had defeated their would-be destroyer, and they had made a young sultan watch helplessly as his city burned. For the next years, every decree Mahmud signed, every plan he considered, would be haunted by the fact that the empire's own army was as much an enemy as any foreign power. Beyond the capital, the provinces slipped further away. In Serbia, a revolution that had begun in 1804 now flared into full war. Villages rose against Ottoman authority, local leaders declared their autonomy, and what had once been the empire's northern frontier hardened into rebellion. To the east and south, governors ignored orders, collected taxes for themselves, and acted less like servants of a sultan than petty kings. Meanwhile, at the empire's frontiers, war dragged on. The empire was still fighting Russia, a conflict that had begun under Selim and now bled into Mahmud's early reign. Ottoman armies struggled on the Danube, poorly supplied and poorly led, while Russian forces pressed deeper into the Balkans. Victory was no longer expected. Mere survival was called success. For Mahmud, it was a bitter introduction to rule, not conquest, not even defense, but retreat and concession. As the empire's borders shrank further, and its enemies learned that the Ottoman sword was dull. And in the midst of it all sat Mahmud, young, untested, and cornered. He was sultan of an empire that no longer feared its ruler, and ruler of a city that no longer obeyed its laws. He could not strike back at the Janissaries. He could not march to Serbia. He could barely keep the palace itself in order. For 4 years, his reign was marked not by command, but by paralysis. He had survived assassination, he had endured enthronement, but now survival meant watching his empire burn, powerless to stop the flames. Mahmud's first years on the throne were not years of rule, but of endurance. He had survived his brother, survived the Janissaries, survived the palace itself, but survival was all he could claim. The fires that had consumed Istanbul had left their mark not only on the city but on its ruler. A lesson that to reign in such an empire meant not commanding but waiting, not shaping events but being shaped by them. And beyond the palace walls, the fires spread. Serbia's uprising hardened into open revolt. Greece began to stir with dreams of independence. Egypt grew bold under a governor who acted like a king. And to the north, Russia pressed harder, forcing Mahmud to trade land for a fragile peace. The years that followed were neither quiet nor stable. They were years in which the empire seemed to smolder at every edge, crises flaring up, not in one place, but in many, as though the House of Osman had become a building filled with small fires that no one could put out. The war with Russia, dragging since the days of Selim III, ended in 1812, but the treaty did not bring peace so much as exhaustion. The Ottomans ceded yet more land along the Danube, and the empire's northern frontier shrank once again. Victory had long ago ceased to be expected. Now survival itself was called success. And when Napoleon finally fell, the Congress of Vienna turned Europe's gaze eastward. For the first time in generations, the great powers could look beyond their own wars. What they saw was an empire in retreat, fragile enough that whispers of decline began long before anyone dared to speak them aloud. Yet even as one war ended, rebellion hardened elsewhere. In Serbia, the uprising that had begun as scattered village resistance turned into a national revolt. Peasants became soldiers, local chiefs became generals, and the once subjugated frontier transformed into a neighbor that would no longer obey. By 1817, Serbia had achieved de facto autonomy, and what should have been a core territory of the empire became instead a symbol of Ottoman weakness, a province lost not to foreign invasion, but to its own people. The flames that smoldered in the Balkans would not stay contained. What had begun in Serbia as revolt against Ottoman rule leapt across the Aegean as sparks caught in Greece. Whispers of resistance turned into plots and conspiracies, nurtured by merchants and intellectuals who spoke of liberty in the language of Europe's revolutions. These were not yet full flames, but embers carried on the wind, glowing hotter with each year, waiting only for the right spark to ignite a blaze. And to the south, another fire burned, not rebellion, but ambition. In Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, once sent as a commander to restore order, began building a power that was his own. He drilled his soldiers in European fashion, taxed the land as though it were his private estate, and ruled not as a servant of the Sultan, but as a sovereign in all but name. This was no uprising from below, but a fire rising from within, the empire's own lifeline slipping into the hands of a man who called himself loyal while acting like a king. Inside the capital, Mahmud was still learning how to rule. The palace that had hidden him as a boy now confronted him with choices that had no easy answers. He signed decrees, presided over councils, and received reports of crisis after crisis, but behind every decision loomed the same truth: the Janissaries. They had destroyed Selim, killed Alamdar, and burned the city in their fury. They were both his guards and his captors. To challenge them was to risk his life, yet to leave them unchallenged was to accept paralysis. For now, he endured, biding his time, watching, weighing. The lessons he learned were bitter: that the empire was fragile, that loyalty could not be assumed, and that power often lay not in the throne itself, but in those willing to seize it. These years did not make Mahmud a great ruler. They did not yet give him victory or reform, but they gave him something else, a kind of grim patience, the ability to watch the empire crumble without being consumed by despair, and to begin asking the question that would define his reign: if not everything could be saved, what could and what must be sacrificed? By 1820, the Ottoman Empire was still vast on paper, but its reality was clear to anyone who looked, including the great powers of Europe. Serbia had slipped away, Greece was stirring, Egypt was rising, and the Janissaries still swaggered through the streets of Istanbul. The fires had not been quenched, they had spread to the gates. By 1820, the Ottoman Empire was still vast on paper, but in truth it was already burning at the edges. Now, in 1821, the flames would burst into open war. The Greek War of Independence began not with a single spark, but with many. Secret societies had plotted for years, whispering of liberty and resurrection. When the moment came, Uprisings broke out across the land, from the mountains of the Morea to the islands of the Aegean. Peasants, priests, and local notables joined forces, seizing fortresses, driving out garrisons, and turning villages into battlegrounds. For the first time, the empire was not facing scattered resistance, but a national revolution that openly declared its aim: freedom from Ottoman rule. The empire struck back with fury. Ottoman troops swept through the Peloponnese, punishing towns with massacre and reprisal. In Istanbul, the ecumenical patriarch Gregory V was dragged from his church and executed on Easter Sunday, his body left hanging at the city gates as a warning. Yet instead of terror breaking the revolt, it hardened it. Greek fighters rallied, and across Europe the news stirred outrage. Poets wrote of liberty against an oppressive empire, newspapers carried tales of atrocities, and what had been a local uprising was transformed into a cause célèbre. In London and Paris, Greece became more than a rebellion. It became a symbol. Philhellenes, men and women who saw in Greece the romantic rebirth of an ancient civilization, raised money, sent volunteers, and demanded that their governments act. Even as the Ottoman treasury strained, European sympathy turned the war into a stage where the empire's every act was judged by foreign eyes. And for the great powers, every judgment was also an opportunity, a chance to weaken the Sultan while extending their own influence in the eastern Mediterranean. And the fighting itself was unlike what the Ottomans had faced before. Greek rebels learned to use the mountains and the seas. Their clefts, brigand fighters turned guerrilla warriors, struck at Ottoman supply lines. Their ships, often little more than merchant vessels armed with fire ships, harassed the Ottoman navy, burning vessels far larger than their own. It was a war of improvisation and desperation, but also one of passion, fueled by the belief that history itself was on their side. For the empire, the war became a drain of blood and gold, and so Sultan Mahmud turned to the one man who could provide both, Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt. Summoned to aid his master, Muhammad Ali sent his son, Ibrahim, at the head of a modern army, drilled in European style and backed by Egypt's growing wealth. Ibrahim's campaigns were ruthless and effective. Towns fell, rebels scattered, and for a moment it seemed as though Egypt might succeed where the Ottoman armies had failed. But here lay the deeper danger. Every victory won by Ibrahim strengthened not Istanbul, but Cairo. Egypt's fleet became the empire's navy, its soldiers the empire's strike force. And Mahmud could see clearly what this meant. The Ottoman state was surviving only by surrendering its lifeblood to a vassal who was no longer a servant, but a rival in all but name. As the war dragged on, the empire's weakness invited intervention. Russia threatened to defend Orthodox Christians. Britain and France, once rivals, found common cause in protecting Greece. Each atrocity, each massacre drew sharper calls for action. And by the mid-1820s, the great powers were no longer just watching. They were preparing to act. Through all of this, Sultan Mahmud changed. He was no longer the boy crowned in chaos, nor the passive ruler overshadowed by the Janissaries. He had endured humiliation, rebellion, and dependence on others, and he had learned bitter patience. Each decree resisted, each reform blocked, convinced him of the same truth. The empire could not live so long as the Janissaries held the state in their grip. They were not his army, they were his jailers. And with every year of war, the question sharpened from abstract reform to simple survival. If not everything could be saved, what must be sacrificed? By 1826, the empire stood at a crossroads. Serbia was autonomous, Greece was aflame, Egypt was rising, and foreign fleets were gathering. But inside Istanbul, Mahmud's gaze had narrowed to the enemy closest at hand. The Janissaries had destroyed his predecessors, defied his orders, and bled the empire of strength. If the empire was to endure, they could no longer be tolerated.
The Janissaries, a corps that no longer fought wars, but made and unmade sultans. Their power had crushed Selim, killed Alemdar, and for years kept Mahmud himself a prisoner inside his own capital. By the 1820s it was clear, no reform, no survival was possible, until the Janissaries themselves were broken. The chance came in 1826. For years Mahmud had been preparing quietly, building loyal regiments on the European model, drilling them in secret, and surrounding himself with advisors who believed that the empire could only be saved by force. The Janissaries, bloated with privilege and jealous of their power, refused every change. They mocked the new drill, scorned the new uniforms, and saw every whisper of reform as a threat to their ancient privileges. When news spread that Mahmud would form a new army to replace them, their response was, as it had always been, revolt. They gathered in their barracks, overturned their cauldrons, the ancient Janissary signal of mutiny, and demanded that the reform be abandoned. But this time the Sultan was ready. Instead of pleading, he raised the banner of the Prophet, the sacred standard kept in the palace since the days of Mehmed the Conqueror. Clerics declared the Janissaries rebels against God and state. Loyal troops, artillerymen, and even common citizens rallied to the Sultan's side. For 3 days, Istanbul shook with violence. Cannons fired into the Janissary barracks, streets filled with smoke. Those who resisted were slaughtered, those who fled were hunted down. When it ended, thousands lay dead. The great squares of Istanbul were heaped with corpses, the streets ran with ash and blood, and the name Janissary, once spoken with awe, became a curse. The corps that had once been the sword of the empire was no more. Like Rome's Praetorian Guard before them, the Janissaries had outlived their purpose. They had gone from guardians to kingmakers, from protectors to predators, and in the end, they were destroyed by the ruler they thought they could control. For Mahmud, this was more than a military confrontation. It was personal. He had hidden in the palace as a boy while Janissaries hunted for him. He had worn the crown under their shadow, never knowing if a riot might end his reign in fire, as it had ended Selim's. Every cannon blast that tore into their barracks was not just the fall of a mutinous corps, but the echo of his own survival. It was vengeance for years of humiliation, for a childhood lived in hiding, for the crown he had worn as their prisoner. It was called the Auspicious Incident, a name that hid the blood and terror of what had happened. Yet it was auspicious in truth, for the empire had been freed from a weight that had dragged it down for centuries. For the first time in living memory, a sultan had destroyed not just a faction, but an entire institution that had defied his authority. Mahmud emerged from the carnage the most powerful sultan in 100 years. He had shown ruthlessness, decisiveness, and above all, the will to reshape the empire by force. The ulama had been used, the people had been frightened, the bureaucracy intimidated. But none of them loved him. The Janissaries were gone, and with them the most stubborn barrier to reform, but also one of the last living links to the empire's ancient traditions. Their destruction made change possible, yet at the same time revealed how deeply the Ottomans still clung to the old ways that gave them identity and cohesion. Mahmud had severed the past to secure the future, but in doing so he exposed a wound that would never fully heal. That every reform would be seen not just as progress, but as betrayal. His successors would inherit this paradox, that the empire could not survive without transformation, yet could not transform without tearing at the very fabric that held it together. The destruction of the Janissaries was more than reform. It was a reckoning, a war not against a foreign enemy, but against the empire's own past.
Victory brought no peace. The empire was in ruins, the Greek rebellion still raged, provinces simmered, and the treasury bled. Across Europe, the courts of London, Paris, and St. Petersburg, Petersburg had watched the purge of the Janissaries with satisfaction, one more proof that the Ottomans were a state forever tearing at themselves. Yet Europe's very contempt also offered Mahmud his only path forward. If the empire was to survive in a world dominated by European arms and navies, then it had to learn from them. The new army came first. Drilled on European lines, clad in uniforms of wool and brass, its officers trained not in the traditions of the Janissary barracks, but in the methods of France and Prussia. Conscription spread into the provinces, pulling peasants into a machine that was no longer a guild but a state institution. For the first time in centuries, the Sultan commanded soldiers who were loyal to him alone. A new bureaucracy, staffed by loyal officials and educated men, began to take shape, bound not to the old orders of Sipahis and Janissaries, but directly to the palace. But Mahmud knew symbols were as powerful as cannon. He set the example in his own body. He shaved his beard, cut his hair in the European style, and ordered portraits of himself in Western uniforms sent across the empire. In his palace, robes of silk and turbans of ceremony were burned, a bonfire of the old order, replaced with frock coats, epaulettes, and the red felt fez. The fez, he declared, would be the badge of the new Ottoman. Simple, modern, universal. He patrolled the streets of Istanbul in disguise, stopping officials who refused to wear it, sometimes tearing the turban from their heads in fury. No reform was too small to enforce personally, no symbol of tradition too sacred to challenge. The changes spread outward, schools teaching modern sciences, new ministries run by salaried bureaucrats, oil paintings replacing the miniatures of old, European clocks ticking in the palace halls, orchestras playing music once condemned as foreign. Mahmud wanted not only a new army, but a new Ottoman soul, but not all souls could be remade. In the Balkans, revolts flared. In Anatolia, tribes resisted conscription and new taxes. Clerics muttered that the fez was an infidel's hat, that the Sultan was tearing at the fabric of Islam itself. Each decree revealed the paradox of his reign. Every reform was necessary, and every reform was seen as betrayal. Even as Mahmud pressed his changes, the wars of the empire dragged on. In Greece, the empire's weakness abroad grew more visible. In 1827, at Navarino, the combined fleets of Britain, France, and Russia annihilated the Ottoman Egyptian navy in a single afternoon. The catastrophe was more than a lost fleet. It was a revelation. The empire could be humbled utterly because Europe's navies willed it so. The Aegean burned again, and with it the last hope of crushing the Greek revolt. By 1830, the struggle was over. Greece was lost, not to the rebels alone, but to the fleets and diplomats of Europe, who had willed an ancient nation back into existence. A province had broken away not through Ottoman weakness alone, but because the great powers had decided it would be so. Even the sacrifices of Mehmed Ali's Egyptian armies had not saved the empire, and their failure planted the seeds of a new quarrel between master and vassal, sultan and pasha. Mahmud's new order had survived, a rival more dangerous than any rebel province. Under Mehmed Ali, Egypt had its own modern army, its own ambitions and its own grievances. The very ally that had rescued the empire might soon test its strength against it, and yet the empire did not fall. Not yet. Mahmud's reforms, his new army, his new order, gave Istanbul a thin shield against the chaos that threatened to consume it. Mahmud had broken the Janissaries, reshaped the army, and remade the empire's face in his own image. He had shown that survival meant transformation, ruthless, relentless transformation. But Europe was circling closer, and the shadow of Egypt was growing longer. The Ottoman Empire was being reborn, yet every birth comes with blood. The empire had lost Greece not on the battlefield, but at the hands of Europe's fleets and chancelleries. Now, as Mahmud looked south, he faced an even greater danger. Egypt had long been the empire's prized possession. Fertile lands, a strategic artery, and the breadbasket of the Sultan's domains. But under Mehmed Ali, the ambitious Albanian commander who had risen from obscurity. Egypt became something more. It became a state within a state, a rival empire in its own right. Mehmed Ali built schools, industries, and above all, an army. Trained by European officers, drilled like the French, equipped with modern muskets and artillery, it was in many ways more advanced than the armies of the Sultan himself. For centuries, Egypt had been the jewel of empires. Rome had called it the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, feeding legions and cities alike. Whoever held Egypt commanded not just its grain, but its wealth, its ports, and its strategic artery to the Red Sea. And from Rome's Caesars to Istanbul's sultans, every ruler feared the same danger, that the general who commanded Egypt might one day turn his armies against the imperial throne itself. Mehmed Ali was that danger reborn. Ali had bled for the Ottoman cause. His troops crushed the Wahhabis in Arabia, his fleets fought in Greece. His sons commanded campaigns on behalf of the Sultan. But the cost of this loyalty was enormous. He demanded Syria, rich, strategic, and vital to his ambitions. When Mahmud refused, the alliance snapped. In 1831, Mehmed Ali unleashed his son Ibrahim Pasha upon the Ottoman heartlands. His army swept through Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria with terrifying speed. Ottoman garrisons crumbled, towns fell, and soon Ibrahim stood poised on the gates of Anatolia itself. It was not the revolt of peasants or the mutiny of Janissaries. It was a modern army, disciplined, confident, and hungry. At the same time, the Ottoman navy faltered. Many officers hesitated to engage Ibrahim's forces, while others quietly sided with Egypt or refused orders outright. The defection of officers mirrored the chaos on land. Ibrahim's army moved unchallenged along the coast, securing supply lines and reinforcing his campaigns on land. The empire's instruments of power were divided. Mahmud rallied what he could. His new army, still untested and raw, marched north to meet Ibrahim. In 1832 at Konya, the two forces collided. It was a disaster. The Ottoman army was routed, its commander captured, its reputation shattered. The road to Istanbul lay open. For Mahmud, the irony was bitter. He had destroyed the Janissaries to build an army of his own, and yet his new creation had failed at the first great test. Reform had saved the throne from the past, but it could not yet protect it from the present. Desperate, Mahmud turned outward. He sought help from Britain and France, appealing to their supposed balance of power politics. But the great powers hesitated. Some preferred a weakened Ottoman state. Others toyed with the ambitions of Mehmed Ali himself. No salvation came. And so, with his back to the wall, Mahmud made the most fateful choice of his reign. He turned to Russia, the empire's oldest enemy, the bear that had clawed at Ottoman lands for a century. In 1833, Russian warships entered the Bosporus. Their soldiers landed on Ottoman soil. The empire was saved from Ibrahim not by its own strength, nor by European goodwill, but by Russian arms. The price of survival was written into a treaty at Hünkar İskelesi. The Ottomans promised friendship, and in secret agreed to close the straits to any warships hostile to Russia. In the struggle to remain independent, the empire had bound itself to dependence. The advance of Ibrahim Pasha did not reach Istanbul. At Kütahya, Russian forces intervened, blocking the Egyptian march and forcing both sides to the negotiating table. The resulting Treaty of Kütahya ended the immediate fighting, ceding Syria and parts of the Levant to Mehmed Ali while leaving him nominally loyal to the Sultan. France and Britain, eager to maintain the balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean, pressured for a settlement that would prevent further escalation, using diplomacy to shape the outcome as much as armies had. For Mahmud, it was a bitter compromise. He had preserved the capital and retained ultimate authority, but at the cost of empowering a vassal who now possessed the army, the navy, and the resources to challenge the Ottoman state again. Europe's diplomats had shaped the outcome as much as armies, as both arbiter and enabler, reminding the Sultan that survival increasingly depended on foreign influence. Mahmud had kept his throne. He had beaten back Mehmed Ali, but only because he had opened the gates to his oldest foe. Reform had brought new strength, but also new dangers. For every victory there was a price, and the greatest price was yet to come. Mahmud was now in his final years. Illness hollowed him, leaving his once powerful frame wasted, his voice weaker, his body confined more and more to his chambers. But his will did not bend. If he could not command armies, he would command paper, ink, and decree. If he could not fight in the field, he would fight from his desk. The reforms did not stop. A census was ordered, the first true attempt to count the empire's population. Registers of men, land, and households poured into Istanbul. For the first time, the state tried to look upon its subjects not as distant provinces or shifting tribes, but as numbers, resources, and taxable bodies. To Mahmud, it was the rational foundation of a modern state. But to many of his people, it was an intrusion, a violation. Villagers and nomads resisted, tribes fled the census takers, and rumors spread that Istanbul sought to enslave its own citizens. A step toward control had also deepened mistrust. At sea, the wounds of Navarino still burned. 3/4 of the Ottoman fleet had been destroyed in the Bay of Greece, leaving the empire's coasts exposed and its pride shattered. Mahmud ordered new shipyards, European-style warships, and foreign advisors to train his sailors. Ironclads and frigates replaced the shattered galleys of the past. The Sultan knew that without a navy, the empire was naked before both rebels and Europe. But in bringing in European designs and officers, he also handed them influence over the very waters that were supposed to shield his throne. Diplomacy, too, was reshaped. Mahmud established permanent embassies abroad, tying his empire to the courts of Paris, Vienna, and London. For centuries, the sultans had expected ambassadors to come to them. Now, Ottoman envoys walked the corridors of Europe, learning languages, absorbing customs, and reporting back. The empire entered the modern diplomatic world, but in doing so, it entered a game it could not fully control. Each embassy was a window outward, but also a doorway inward, through which Europe could peer and pry into Ottoman affairs. At home, Mahmud pursued legal reform. New codes sought to streamline justice, to centralize authority, to replace the patchwork of old practices with something modern. Civil courts grew alongside the Sharia. He sought to standardize justice across the empire, issuing codes that mirrored aspects of French civil law. Property disputes, trade contracts, and taxation were pulled out of the hands of local notables and religious judges, placed instead under state-appointed officials. To Mahmud, it was a step toward equality before the law, a modern empire ruled not by custom, but by statute. Yet to many communities, it felt like another chain from Istanbul, a stripping away of their autonomy and traditions. To conservatives, it was betrayal. To reformers, it was still too little. The Sultan had tried to balance tradition with modernity, but each compromise satisfied neither side. Every victory came with resentment. Every reform left a scar. Mahmud was not blind to the contradictions. He had torn down the Janissaries, but the new army that replaced them had faltered at its first true test. He had embraced reform to strengthen the empire, but each decree pulled his state closer to Europe and farther from the traditions that had once bound it together. He knew he was building something new, but whether it was a fortress or a fragile shell, even he could not say. And yet he pressed on. Even from his sickbed, he dictated orders, signed decrees, pushed for more. He was sustained by a single vision, that the empire might outlive him, that when his breath failed, the state would remain, stronger than it had been when he found it. But he knew his time was short. His doctors whispered the word tuberculosis. And so all eyes turned to his heir, a boy of 16, Abdul Mejid. Quiet, studious, impressionable. He was no warrior, no iron-willed reformer like his father.
but he was the vessel into which Mahmud poured his hopes and his burdens. The empire's future would be his to carry, and always on the southern horizon, Egypt loomed. Mehmed Ali had not been broken. He had been rewarded. Syria, Lebanon, and the Levant now swelled his power, and his son Ibrahim commanded a battle-hardened army on the empire's doorstep. Everyone in Istanbul knew it was only a matter of time before Egypt would march again. Mahmud's reforms, his armies, his fleets, all were being rebuilt under the shadow of a second war that might decide the empire's survival, whilst under the ever-watchful eye of the European powers, who saw every Ottoman conflict as an opportunity. Egypt's position, commanding the Nile, the Levantine ports, and the route to the Red Sea, was a prize in itself. And in whispers across European palace hallways and parliament corridors, some already imagined the greater prize, a canal, carved through Egypt, that would bind the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean and make whoever held it master of global trade. Mahmud had built and broken, reshaped and scarred, strengthened and weakened. He had been ruthless, visionary, desperate, and defiant. But as his body failed, he could not escape the truth. His dream of an enduring empire was no longer his to command. It would belong to his son, and to the Europe watching eagerly from across the seas.
The Sultan was dying. For years, tuberculosis had hollowed Mahmud II, the man who had once stormed the barracks of the Janissaries, who had ruled with fire and iron, now coughed blood into his handkerchief. His body wasted, his voice faltered, but his pen never stopped moving. Decrees flowed even as his strength failed, a ruler trying to outpace his own mortality. In June 1839, Mahmud breathed his last. For 31 years he had ruled, longer than most of his ancestors in these turbulent centuries. His reign had been survival, reform, defiance, and compromise. Now the Iron Sultan was gone. Istanbul mourned, but uneasily. His funeral was a pageant of power and fragility. Cannon fire boomed across the Bosphorus. Prayers rose in every mosque, and the empire gathered to honor its fallen ruler. But beneath the mourning hung a darker question. What now? Mahmud left behind an empire transformed but unfinished. He had abolished the Janissaries, but his new army had already been broken by Egypt. He had rebuilt the fleet, only to see it sail into the hands of his enemy and burn. He had introduced censuses, civil codes, embassies and shipyards, each a step toward modernity, each also a new chain binding Istanbul to Europe and destroying the links to the past. His reign had been a war of decrees against decay, and he had won just enough to keep the empire alive. But survival is not salvation. Mahmud's empire was a house under construction with its builder gone. The tools were laid out, the foundations had been poured, but the structure itself was fragile, exposed, and unfinished. Whether it would endure depended not on him, but on the boy who now inherited it. Abdülmecid. Abdülmecid's childhood was spent in the shadow of a father who ruled with iron and fire. The young prince grew up within the guarded walls of the palace, where lessons began at dawn and ended at dusk. His mother, Besmi-Alem Sultan, a woman of quiet piety and strong will, guided much of his upbringing. She instilled in him a taste for charity and education, virtues that would mark his reign as surely as his father's severity had marked his own. Tutors filled the boy's world with books and languages. He learned Arabic and Persian, but also French, the language of diplomacy, the tongue of Europe. He listened eagerly, repeating phrases until he spoke with fluency. He was the first Ottoman prince to master it, and the fact did not go unnoticed by foreign ambassadors. To them, he was already a bridge, a boy who could move easily between the old world of Istanbul and the salons of Paris. Yet, beneath the surface lay fragility. Abdülmecid was no warrior. He did not ride at the head of regiments as his ancestors had. He played music, read poetry, and entertained tutors with questions about Europe's sciences and philosophies. Courtiers found him gentle, well-mannered, even soft. To reformers, he was the ideal ruler for a new age. Curious, cosmopolitan, unburdened by Janissary violence or old rivalries. To skeptics, He was a boy, unready for the storms that awaited him. A 16-year-old prince, more scholar than soldier, quiet, impressionable, untested. His palace education had kept him safe from the blood and terror that had defined his father's reign. He had not faced the court of Mustafa, never hidden in the baths. It meant that when the hour came, he would inherit not only an empire in crisis, but a throne for which nothing in his sheltered life had prepared him. The ministers who had served his father now looked to him, fearful and uncertain. Reformers saw hope, conservatives saw weakness, foreign ambassadors saw opportunity. And across the horizon, Egypt loomed, stronger than ever, with Ibrahim Pasha's army poised and waiting. The empire's survival hung not on Mahmud's decrees, but on the choices of his son, and on the mercy or threat of Europe, and the shadow of a vassal who might rise again. The Iron Sultan was gone. The world that replaced him was more fragile, more uncertain, more dangerous. One sick man had perished, but a greater sickness lingered, and all Europe watched to see whether the empire itself would soon waste away. Mahmud II's death was announced with cannon fire across the Bosphorus. The city mourned, but uneasily. His funeral was spectacle and warning at once. The empire could still project grandeur, yet beneath the robes and prayers was a darker truth. The Ottoman state was fragile. The empire's last strong sultan was gone. Onto the throne stepped a boy of 16, Abdülmecid. Abdülmecid's childhood had been shaped not by soldiers or campaigns, but by books and tutors. His mother, Besmi Sultan, guided him with quiet discipline and a devotion to piety and charity. From her, he absorbed an instinct for generosity, the kind of ruler who built schools and hospitals, who gave coins to the poor. From her, he inherited a heart. From his father, he inherited a burden, unfinished reforms, and an empire with wolves at the gates. The young prince studied Arabic and Persian, but also French, the first Ottoman heir to master it fluently. He read newspapers from Paris, absorbed the language of diplomacy, and dreamed in European idioms. Ambassadors whispered that here was a boy who could bridge two worlds. Reformers in the palace dared to hope he might continue Mahmud's vision without his father's iron. Courtiers called him gentle, curious, impressionable, a scholar prince, more at home with poetry than politics. For reformers, this made him the perfect vessel. For conservatives, it made him weak. For Europe, it made him vulnerable. And Europe was already circling. To the north, Russia watched. To the west, Britain and France weighed their interests. The Eastern question, would the Ottoman Empire survive, and who would inherit it if it did not, had become the obsession of every cabinet in Europe. In this moment of fear, Abdülmecid inherited not a crown of power, but a seat of dependency. He was greeted with two expectations that would define his reign. Reformers demanded he continue his father's path, building a state strong enough to survive. Europe demanded he continue reform as performance, proof that the Ottomans were civilized, worthy of protection, pliable enough to be managed. To rule meant balancing both. The boy Sultan began with gestures of conciliation. He promised to uphold his father's decrees, listened intently to his ministers, and leaned heavily on men like Mustafa Reshid Pasha, a diplomat fresh from London and Paris who believed the empire's only chance lay in adopting European models of governance. Already the Tanzimat, the reorganization, was taking shape in embryo, with Abdülmecid as its willing figurehead. But the empire he inherited was not simply reforming, it was unraveling. In Syria, in Kurdistan, in the Balkans, provinces stirred uneasily. In the capital, Janissary ghosts haunted a new army still brittle from defeat. In the palace, conservatives muttered that reforms had brought only humiliation, and clerics warned that aping Europe would destroy the empire's soul. The Sultan was not yet a man, but the weight of centuries sat upon his shoulders, and to the southeast, Muhammad Ali's banners still flew, a reminder that the empire's greatest enemy was not yet done. Prior to his death, Mahmud gambled on one last campaign against Egypt. In 1839, Ottoman forces marched east to break Muhammad Ali's grip on Syria. Once the Sultan's most ambitious governor, now ruled more like a rival monarch. He had taken Syria, humbled Ottoman garrisons, and built an army drilled by French officers, clothed in European uniforms, and commanded by his son, Ibrahim Pasha, a general as brilliant as he was ruthless. Advisors from Europe, even the young Prussian officer Helmuth von Moltke, rode with the army. On paper, this was a reformed force, drilled, reorganized, clad in new uniforms. But on the field at Nizip, appearance collapsed into reality. Ibrahim Pasha's veterans shattered them in a single day. The modernized Ottoman army broke, and with it broke the illusion that reforms alone could save the empire overnight. The irony was bitter. The Egyptians fought with European skill, funded and trained by French officers. The Ottomans fought with European advisors too, Moltke among them, yet their reforms were half-finished, their soldiers unready. It was not just an Ottoman defeat, it was a European duel fought with Ottoman and Egyptian blood. By the time news of the disaster reached Istanbul, Mahmud was already on his deathbed. He died as his armies lay in ruins, leaving a 16-year-old heir to inherit not just the throne, but a war already lost. Syria was gone, Egypt stood triumphant, and the last hope of reversing Ottoman decline by force had collapsed. Worse still, Europe's shadow already loomed over the battlefield. With France backing Muhammad Ali, Britain and Austria leaned towards the Ottomans, not out of friendship, but to block French influence. Russia watched hungrily for weakness. Even before Abdulmajid raised his hand to swear his oaths, his empire was already the prize in a proxy war. Survival would no longer be decided only in Istanbul or on the battlefield, but in the drawing rooms of London, Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. At 16, Abdulmajid stood before his court in robes too large, his voice soft but determined. He swore to protect his people, to continue his father's work, to be a ruler for a new age. But his words carried an echo of desperation. This empire could no longer save itself alone. Survival meant alliances. Reform meant entanglement. Sovereignty meant compromise. Whether he could hold it together or whether Europe would hold it for him remained to be seen. And as the empire reeled from defeat on land, an even greater humiliation waited at sea.
By the time news of Nizip reached Istanbul, Mahmud II had already breathed his last. The city mourned its Iron Sultan, whose reforms had promised strength but delivered fragility in their unfinished state. As Abdulmajid ascended the throne, some whispered that the writing was already on the wall for the war, and for the Ottoman Empire itself. Those whispers were loudest in the navy, where officers and sailors debated loyalties, measured opportunities, and quietly questioned whether their allegiance lay with the Sultan or with survival. The news spread like wildfire. The Ottoman fleet, the very pride of Mahmud's late reforms, had defected. Entire squadrons of ships, under the command of Kapudan Pasha, the Grand Admiral, sailed south and delivered themselves into the hands of Muhammad Ali. The Sultan's warships, trained, armed, and paid for at crushing expense, now anchored under Egyptian colors. The motives of the Grand Admiral remain debated. Some say bribery, others disillusionment, still others an opportunistic gamble. But the meaning was plain. Loyalty inside the empire was fragile, even for sale. For a boy, Sultan scarcely weeks into his reign, it was his first true lesson in the politics of survival. The humiliation was almost unbearable. His father, Mahmud, had rebuilt this navy as a symbol of revival, a monument to his campaign of reform. Now, in Abdulmajid's first months, it was gone, not lost in battle, but surrendered by treachery. The capital erupted in panic. Istanbul was a city of the sea, perched between the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, Lifelines carried not just grain and goods, but the very sense that the empire was still connected, still relevant. Without a fleet, the Ottomans were exposed, their coasts undefended, their trade at the mercy of others, their prestige in ruins. In mosques, sermons thundered against treachery. On the streets, people muttered that the empire was cursed for abandoning the old ways. Had God finally abandoned the Ottomans? Clerics warned that reforms had brought only humiliation. Reformers countered that the empire had not reformed enough. In the palace, silence reigned. The boy sultan could offer words but no solutions. Ministers in the palace stared at one another with silence that bordered on despair. The boy sultan could do nothing but watch. It was his first lesson in rule. Loyalty was fragile, even at the highest ranks. The authority that a sultan once carried had eroded perhaps beyond repair, and already Europe was circling the wreck. The crisis pulled Europe into motion. France, already entangled with Muhammad Ali, Paris saw in him not only a modernizing strongman, but a client to shape the Eastern Mediterranean in France's image. French officers had drilled his army, advised his administration, and even helped model his fleet. To Paris, Egypt offered a vision of the East remade in France's image. Britain and Austria moved to block this, not out of love for the Ottomans, but to deny French power over the trade routes of the Levant. Metternich in Vienna schemed to keep the Eastern question contained, while Palmerston in London feared for the safety of the Mediterranean lifeline, a lifeline that would one day flow through a canal at Suez. The Eastern question sharpened to a naval question. Who would dominate the seas that bound Europe, Asia, and Africa together? Russia, too, offered help to its new friend, keen to extend its own shadow across the Black Sea and into the Straits. The Ottoman Sultan, barely a teenager, was little more than the object of negotiation between leaders and men far his senior in European-style diplomacy and warfare. His empire had become the battlefield of a proxy war, its fate decided in the drawing rooms of London, Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. By 1840, the great powers decided. The Treaty of London stripped Muhammad Ali of Syria and confined him to hereditary rule in Egypt. When he resisted, it was not Ottoman guns that broke his grip, but European ones. British and Austrian fleets sailed the Levant. They bombarded Beirut. They reduced Acre, a fortress that had resisted Napoleon himself with devastating modern firepower. In weeks, Muhammad Ali's expansion crumbled, not before Ottoman might, but before European naval supremacy. The Ottomans celebrated victory, but in truth it was no victory of their own. The fleet that had betrayed them was never truly recovered. The empire had been saved, but only because Europe knew what they could gain. Dependency. The symbolism was impossible to miss. At sea, the Ottomans no longer commanded their own fate. Their ships were gone. Their ports lay under the shadow of foreign squadrons. Their survival depended on Europe's willingness to keep them afloat. Britain emerged as the master of the Mediterranean, protector, enforcer, and quiet jailer. For London especially, the Ottoman crisis had been more than a war. It was routine, a tried and tested way of how British sea power could dictate terms, a classic portrayal of protecting their trade routes and utilizing crisis to extend influence. As the defection of the fleet and losses on land would sink the Ottoman Empire into even more financial strain, which perhaps could help France and England control the Ottomans even more than the military and naval dependencies. For Abdul-Majid, this was his first real test. He had done nothing to lose the fleet and nothing to win it back. His empire had endured, but only because Europe deemed it useful. Each victory now came with shackles. Alliances that dictated terms, rescues that felt like occupations. In London, statesmen spoke of preserving the balance of power. In Istanbul, it felt like submission dressed up as salvation. The boy sultan absorbed the lesson. The empire could no longer survive on its own. Sovereignty was no longer a shield. It was a performance, tolerated only so long as it suited the great powers. In our next episode, Mustafa Reşid Pasha steps forward.
Mustafa Reşid Pasha was born in 1800, just as the empire slid into crisis on every frontier. His family were minor bureaucrats, but he rose quickly by mastering the art of diplomacy. He spoke French with ease, quoted European thinkers, and charmed foreign envoys who found in him a man who seemed civilized in their own image. As a young attaché in Paris and London, He absorbed not just languages but political culture. He studied how cabinets debated, how parliaments legislated, and how law restrained power. Unlike many Ottoman envoys, he did not just observe Europe, he admired it. For him, the empire's survival lay in adopting its methods, not resisting them. Back in Istanbul, Reshid's career flourished under Mahmud II, who needed men fluent in the new diplomacy of Europe. He was sent to Paris, then London, to negotiate during the Egyptian crisis. He learned quickly that Europe judged the Ottomans not by victories, but by reforms. If the empire could appear modern, it might win sympathy, perhaps even protection. In London, Reshid sparred politely with Lord Palmerston, Britain's formidable foreign secretary. Palmerston was blunt where Reshid was patient, but both men understood the stakes: Egypt, the Straits, the Mediterranean balance. Reshid learned quickly that diplomacy in Europe was not a game of equals. He was respected, even admired, but always treated as the envoy of a state on probation. Metternich in Vienna was subtler, the master of conservative order, who viewed Reshid's reforms as useful so long as they kept the Ottoman Empire stable, but dangerous if they stirred unrest. Even in Paris, where he spent years as ambassador, Reshid moved in the orbit of men like François Guizot, foreign minister and later prime minister of France. Their salons dazzled him with Enlightenment airs, but beneath the civility lay the same hard calculus. France courted Muhammad Ali in Egypt, while flattering the Ottomans in Istanbul. Reshid could drink their wine and trade their courtesies, but he never forgot that every smile masked a rival claim. His European postings left him fluent not only in French, but in the unspoken language of power, the art of appearing agreeable while defending a fragile empire. These negotiations forged Reshid's character. He admired Europe's institutions, but he saw too how casually its leaders treated Ottoman sovereignty. Palmerston often lectured him as if Istanbul were already a client state. Guizot hinted that true modernization meant aligning with French tutelage. Even Metternich spoke of the empire's survival less as a right than as a convenience for Europe's balance of power. Reshid returned from these postings convinced of two things: that only reform could make the empire respectable in European eyes, and that respect itself was already another form of dependence. This conviction hardened into a mission to save the empire through law, not war. Where Mahmud had destroyed the Janissaries with cannon, Reshid believed you could dismantle decay with paper decrees. But if Europe pushed him one way, the Ottoman court pulled the other. Figures like Husrev Pasha, a veteran Grand Vizier and hardened conservative, loathed Reshid's fascination with European models. To Husrev, reform meant weakness, a surrender of Ottoman traditions to foreign meddling. Clerics, too, fumed that codifying law and tampering with custom was an assault on the empire's Islamic backbone. Reshid fought these battles not with soldiers but with memoranda and decrees, penning arguments late into the night to prove that reform was not betrayal, but survival. The conflict became personal. Husrev Pasha, once his patron, turned into his bitterest rival, using his networks in the palace to undermine Reshid's authority. The court became a chessboard, conservatives whispering in the Sultan's ear, reformers pleading for time, foreign ambassadors pressing their advantage. For Abdülmecid, Reshid Pasha arrived as more than a minister. He was a mentor, almost a father figure, guiding the boy Sultan through the bewildering world of diplomacy in a language he understood. Abdülmecid admired his eloquence, his confidence before European envoys, and his ability to translate Ottoman weakness into promises of reform. The Sultan, shy and impressionable, absorbed his vision almost whole. The empire, Reshid argued, needed not just armies and fleets, but laws, clear codes of justice, equal taxation, protections for property, even rights for Christians and Jews, all written down, proclaimed publicly, and enforced by bureaucrats rather than palace whim. This would not only calm restless provinces but impress Europe, proving that the Ottomans belonged among civilized nations. In this, Reshid was both a reformer and something more troubling, a servant of foreign expectation. Every decree drafted in Istanbul was measured against the applause it might win in Paris or London. Reform became performance, sovereignty a negotiation.
The climax came in November 1839 as the empire reeled from Nizip and the naval betrayal. In the rose garden of the Topkapi Palace, before assembled dignitaries and foreign ambassadors, Mustafa Rashid read aloud the Edict of Gulhan. It promised security of life, honor and property for all subjects. It pledged regular taxation, fairer military conscription, and trials before law. It was a vision of empire as constitutional order, an empire that ruled not by decree alone, but by principle. For Europeans it was dazzling. For reformers, it was salvation. For conservatives, it was heresy. The Tanzimat, the reorganization, was born, but from the beginning, it carried the paradox of its architect. Mustafa Rashid Pasha wanted to save the empire, yet every promise of reform bound the Ottomans more tightly to European judgment. Every decree was another proof offered to the great powers that the Ottomans were civilized enough to be protected and pliable enough to be managed. Abdülmecid embraced it fully. He was now the most European-minded sultan in Ottoman history, fluent in French, guided by a Europeanized statesman draped in the language of reform. But admiration carried its own dangers. A sultan whose sovereignty depended on others was not strong. He was vulnerable.
On a cold November morning in 1839, dignitaries gathered beneath the cypresses of the Gulhani Park. The setting was chosen carefully, open, ceremonial, unmistakably imperial. Yet the script was written by Mustafa Rashid Pasha, the reformer who had returned from London and Paris, convinced that only European-style law could save the empire. Abdülmecid, dressed in resplendent robes, read aloud the words that would become known as the Edict of Gulhani. It was nothing less than a promise to remake the empire. Subjects, whether Muslim or Christian, would be equal before the law. Taxes would be regular, not arbitrary. Conscription would be fair. Life, honor, and property would be guaranteed by the state. For a society long accustomed to decree, whim, and privilege, this was a revolution of words. After the edict was read, applause in the gardens was not universal. In the palace, senior statesmen exchanged uneasy looks. Men like Husrev Pasha, once Mahmud II's trusted enforcer, muttered that law could not replace command, that equality between Muslims and Christians was not reform, but further betrayal. Some of the ulama, the religious scholars who had outlasted sultans and viziers alike, warned from their pulpits that the edict was nothing but a surrender to the infidel, a violation of the very principles that had once made the Ottomans strong, being further assaulted by the son of Mahmud II. Resistance did not yet break into revolt, but it whispered in corridors and sermons the boy sultan was giving away too much. And while the edict promised justice and prosperity, the empire's treasury was already hollow. Wars with Russia, rebellions in the Balkans, and the catastrophe of Nizip had drained what little reserves Mahmud had left. Reform itself was expensive. New uniforms, new schools, new courts, new salaries for a swelling bureaucracy. Already loans were being discussed, quiet conversations with European bankers who saw in Ottoman fragility not just risk, but an incredible opportunity for gains that weren't just financial but territorial. The Tanzimat was dressed in noble ideals, but beneath its robes lay the first chains of debt. The Europeans, of course, understood this perfectly. To Palmerston in London, a bankrupt Ottoman Empire was a compliant one. To Metternich, reforms promised stability without strength, the perfect balance to keep the empire alive but dependent. The boy Sultan thought he was winning admiration. In truth, he was tightening the leash. For reformers, the moment was electric. Abdülmecid, scarcely 17, seemed to embody a new vision, an Ottoman sultan as constitutional monarch, a ruler who governed by law rather than command. To his ministers, especially Rashid Pasha, he was the ideal vessel, earnest, believing, unscarred by the cynicism of older rulers, and easy to manipulate. For conservatives, however, the words sounded dangerous. Equality between Muslim and Christian, a bureaucracy governed by statute rather than faith. These were not Ottoman traditions. These were foreign imitations, and foreign eyes were watching. European ambassadors nodded gravely as the words were read, and in their capitals newspapers applauded the proclamation. To Paris and London, the Ottomans had declared themselves civilized, reassurance that Ottoman weakness would not collapse before Britain had secured its sea routes. To Metternich in Vienna, it was proof that the empire might yet be managed into survival. Europe was impressed, but not deceived. This was performance as much as policy. For Abdülmecid, however, the applause mattered. He believed, with the idealism of youth, that if Europe respected the empire would endure. That law could substitute for strength, that words could repair what armies and navies had failed to defend. He mistook recognition for security, the nods of European envoys for shields against European power. The irony was cruel. The Edict of Gulhane promised equality, but in the provinces, Christians and Muslims eyed each other with suspicion. It promised fair taxation, but the treasury remained bankrupt. It promised military reform, but the fleet lay in Egyptian hands. The Sultan proclaimed rights with a flourish, but his empire could not yet enforce them. The world applauded. The empire exhaled. But beneath the cypresses of Gulhane, the Ottoman state had revealed its desperation. Survival now depended on European approval as much as on Ottoman strength. The Tanzimat began to take form not in parades or ceremonies, but in offices. Ministries multiplied. Turbans were replaced with fezes, robes with European-style uniforms. French became the language of the educated elite, the key to advancement in a bureaucracy now modeled on Paris. To walk through the corridors of the Sublime Porte in the 1840s was to see an empire trying to reinvent itself on paper. Ledgers, codes, contracts, reports. But the reforms bit deepest where they were least welcome. In the provinces, powerful ayans, local notables who had grown rich taxing peasants and trading with Europe, saw their privileges threatened. In the provinces, resistance was sharper than in Istanbul. In Syria, Druze sheikhs and Arab notables who had grown accustomed to Egyptian rule bristled at new taxes and conscription orders from the Tanzimat state. In the Balkans, Muslim landowners in Bosnia refused to accept equal status for their Christian peasants, treating reform as an attack on their centuries-old privileges. Even in Albania, where Mahmud II had once stamped out Janissary power, new decrees sparked unrest among tribal leaders who guarded their autonomy fiercely. In the Balkans, Christian merchants welcomed equal rights, but bristled at heavier tax collection. Reform on paper was one thing. Reform in distant mountain valleys was another. Every step of reform seemed to provoke another pocket of resistance. If the provinces resisted reform, the military demanded it. Humiliated by Egypt and Nizip, needed rebuilding. European officers returned in force. Prussian officers, building on Helmuth von Moltke's earlier surveys, advised on drilling and officer training, though their proposals often clashed with Ottoman traditions. At sea, British dockyards became lifelines, supplying frigates and training officers in the new steam navy. Britain sent Admiral Sir Baldwin Wake Walker reorganized the shattered navy, introducing steam power and British methods, while the empire poured scarce treasure into ships like the Mahmud, a colossal vessel launched earlier but refitted as a showpiece of Ottoman ambition, then the largest wooden warship in the world, a floating palace of 128 guns. Yet its construction swallowed funds the treasury could not spare, and its upkeep required imported materials and expertise. The Mahmudiyya stood less as proof of independence than as a monument to Ottoman dependence on European credit and technology. The irony was plain. The Tanzimat promised Ottoman strength, but its armies and fleets were trained, supplied, and sometimes commanded by foreigners. Alongside soldiers came a new breed of European, engineers, lawyers, and teachers who shaped the empire in quieter ways. British engineers began sketching early railway lines and telegraph routes. French legal experts advised on codifying Ottoman law, laying foundations that would culminate in the Mishal decades later. Doctors and architects introduced European models of hospitals and schools. Each project was sold as progress, but each also opened new doors for foreign oversight. Every mile of track, every telegraph wire, every codified statute tied the empire more tightly to European expectations. A modern empire, but one built on borrowed blueprints and, more importantly, borrowed money. And always in the shadows stood the ambassadors. None loomed larger than Stratford Canning, Britain's man in Constantinople, the Sultan maker. Urbane, domineering, and tireless, Canning acted less like an envoy and more like a proconsul, pressing Abdülmecid to deepen reforms, to liberalize trade, to align with British policy. To the Sultan, his counsel seemed flattering. To Ottoman conservatives, it was naked interference. Metternich in Vienna watched closely, warning that too much reform could invite revolution. In Paris, Guizot sent envoys who smiled politely while quietly courting Egypt. All of this cost money the empire did not have. Wars, rebellions, and the humiliation at Nizip had already drained Mahmud's reserves. Now, every reform demanded new uniforms, schools, and salaries for an expanding bureaucracy. Into this vacuum stepped the Galata bankers of Istanbul, Greeks, Armenians, and Jews, with links to European houses like the Rothschilds. Their loans filled immediate gaps, but at crushing interest. Even before the first great foreign loan of the 1850s, some provincial taxes were already pledged directly to bankers before they were even collected. The Tanzimat promised liberation through law, but it came shackled to debt. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define the Tanzimat. Debt disguised as modernization, sovereignty pawned in increments. By the late 1840s, Abdülmecid stood in a palace that glittered with European refinements, surrounded by ministers who spoke in French, advised by foreign experts who seemed indispensable. But outside those walls, suspicion deepened. Clerics denounced reforms as heresy. Provincial elites resisted conscription and taxation. To many of his subjects, the Sultan no longer looked like a caliph of Islam. He looked like a foreign prince in Ottoman robes. The Tanzimat was real: ministries, laws, uniforms, even a new navy. But it was also fragile. Each reform bought applause in Europe and resentment at home. Abdülmecid mistook one for strength, not yet seeing how every debt, every advisor, every concession bound him more tightly to foreign hands. To his subjects, every bow to Europe was not diplomacy, but betrayal, proof their sultan no longer stood with them. The first sparks came in the Arab provinces. In Syria, the Tanzimat collided head-on with communities still shaped by Muhammad Ali's decade of rule. The Egyptian system of conscription and taxation had already scarred the Druze and Maronite mountaineers, and when the Ottomans reimposed new levies and draft orders in the 1840s, it was met with revolt. Druze sheikhs in Mount Lebanon refused Istanbul's orders, rejecting a state that demanded sons for armies and coin for treasuries, while Arab notables in Damascus roused townsmen against inspectors sent from the capital. The Sublime Porte responded with troops, but suppression only deepened the bitterness that would later explode in sectarian massacres in the 1860s. Syria was a warning. Reform imposed from the center looked to its people like just another foreign occupation. Merchants muttered that equal status for Christians tilted the scales against them, that the Tanzimat was not reform, but foreign meddling dressed in fine words. In Baghdad and the plains of Mesopotamia, Tanzimat officials tried to extend tax registers and conscription rolls into regions where Ottoman control had long been nominal. Tribal sheikhs and Kurdish agas resisted fiercely, staging raids on Ottoman garrisons and tax caravans. The Ottoman response was classic Tanzimat, a blend of reformist ideal and raw violence. Governors like Namuk Pasha marched against tribes with cannon, forcing them to submit, but the cycle repeated year after year. Discontent simmered among both Sunni tribes and Shia communities, long skeptical of Ottoman rule. Here, clerics denounced reform as heresy, and local governors often looked the other way, caught between imperial orders and the danger of inflaming revolt. Abdulmajid's empire looked united on maps, but on the ground, obedience was conditional, fragile, and costly. In Kurdistan, the rebellion of Bedir Khan Beg in the 1840s stood out. A powerful Kurdish emir, Bedir Khan resisted centralization and Tanzimat decrees, carving out an almost independent principality. His defiance was crushed only after years of campaigns, culminating in 1847, when Ottoman troops, with quiet European encouragement, finally subdued him. Bedir Khan was exiled, but the suppression came at a cost. Tens of thousands displaced, villages razed, and Kurdish distrust of Istanbul hardened for generations. For Abdulmajid, it was a bitter lesson that reform often meant civil war by another name. It symbolized a truth the Tanzimat could not suppress. Beyond the capital, real power still lay with men whose legitimacy came from tribe, faith, and sword. Each rebellion revealed a paradox. The Tanzimat promised equality and law, but it required brute force to enforce them. Abdulmajid found himself torn between ideals and suppression, declaring rights in the capital while dispatching armies to the provinces. His faith in law remained, but the lesson was unavoidable. Reforms provoked rebellion faster than they delivered unity, and every campaign carried another hidden cost. To march armies into Kurdistan or the plains of Mesopotamia meant borrowing, first from the Galata bankers of Istanbul, then through the credit networks of Europe. Each rebellion left not just ashes in the provinces, but new chains of debt in the capital. The Ottomans were fighting their own subjects with money borrowed from foreigners who would later claim repayment in influence. All of this unfolded as Europe itself trembled. In 1848, barricades rose in Paris, revolutionaries stormed Vienna, and monarchs from Naples to Berlin tottered on the edge of collapse. Abdulmajid's throne did not shake in the same way, but the echoes were impossible to ignore. In Vienna, Metternich, the great stabilizer of Europe and ally of the Ottoman order, fled into exile. Franz Joseph rose to the Habsburg throne amid the rubble of Hungarian revolt, in which Lajos Kossuth preached independence, his fiery words echoing into Ottoman lands where subject peoples listened closely. Bismarck watched from Prussia as liberals and reactionaries clashed. Napoleon III seized power in France with a promise of order, and Nicholas I of Russia posed as Europe's gendarme. Against this backdrop, the Ottoman state seemed strangely inverted. While Europe's monarchs feared their peoples, the Ottoman Sultan was fighting to make his people accept reforms Europe demanded. To the British, especially Stratford Canning, the rebellions were useful leverage, proof that Istanbul needed guidance, loans, and British mediation. For the Ottoman state, this was no victory. European revolution meant European distraction. Britain and Austria, who had once saved the empire from Muhammad Ali, were consumed by their own crises, and when they recovered, they did so more suspicious than ever of instability. If the Ottomans could not keep order at home, then European protection would have to become firmer, more direct. Abdülmecid ruled an empire that was at once modern and medieval. In Istanbul, he presided over balls, operas, and bureaucrats fluent in French. In the provinces, his armies fought sheikhs, beys, and tribal leaders who treated the Tanzimat as foreign intrusion. Europe praised reform in words, but demanded stability in deeds. Stability the empire could only enforce with violence. The Ottoman army, rebuilt on European lines, had to be sent again and again into the mountains and deserts to crush leaders who claimed loyalty only when convenient. Each crackdown left the countryside devastated, the treasury drained, and the army spread thinner. The irony was brutal. The Tanzimat, intended to bind the provinces closer to the center, instead kept the empire fighting wars against its own subjects. The lesson for Abdülmecid was bitter. Applause from Europe never stopped the rebellions. Promises of equality did not bring loyalty, and each suppression, each plea for European mediation, only revealed how fragile the empire had become. By 1850, most fires were tamped down, but none were truly out. Each pacified province had been bought with borrowed money and borrowed authority, and every dispatch to Europe read less like diplomacy than a plea for reassurance. In London, Vienna, Paris, and St. Petersburg, the Ottomans were no longer a partner to be respected, but a problem to be managed. Abdülmecid found himself in a paradox. In Europe, emperors feared their people. In Istanbul, the Sultan feared he could not reach his people at all. Reform had promised strength but delivered insurrections. Law had promised justice but was enforced by cannon. The Tanzimat was not just resisted, it had set the empire at war with itself. The Eastern question shifted from villages to chancelleries. Britain and Austria spoke of stability. France courted prestige in the Levant, and Russia pressed its claims as protector of Orthodox Christians. In private, a cruel shorthand began to circulate for an empire that could not stand without help. A sick man, ailing, manageable, perhaps terminal. By the early 1850s, the Ottomans faced not just rebels at home, but predators abroad. The empire sat at the center of what Britain and Russia now called the Eastern Question, the fate of Ottoman lands once the empire finally collapsed. It was not a question of if, but when. In St. Petersburg, Tsar Nicholas I spoke bluntly. To British envoys, he described the Ottomans as a man dying in his bed, the sick man of Europe. It was a cruel phrase, but accurate enough to stick. For Nicholas, the Ottoman corpse was an opportunity. Protectorates in the Balkans, control of the Straits, perhaps even Constantinople itself. He pressed his claims under the holy banner of orthodoxy, demanding rights for Christians in Ottoman lands. But every diplomat knew it was power, not piety, that drove him. Only a few years earlier, Nicholas had marched his armies into Hungary to save Franz Joseph's throne from collapse. In Vienna, he was hailed as the savior of monarchy. In Istanbul, the same intervention looked like a warning. Today, Hungary; tomorrow, the Balkans. In London, Lord Palmerston watched warily. Britain needed the Ottoman Empire alive, at least long enough to block Russia's route to the Mediterranean and beyond to India. To Stratford Canning, now Lord Stratford de Redcliffe, Britain's towering ambassador in Istanbul, the Ottoman court became his personal stage. Urbane, domineering, and untiring, he coaxed, lectured, and bullied Abdülmecid as though he were a schoolboy monarch, steering reforms when convenient and vetoing them when not. For conservatives in Istanbul, Stratford was no ambassador. He was the empire's real vizier. In Paris, Louis Napoleon, soon to crown himself Napoleon III, weighed prestige against profit. He positioned France as the Catholic champion in the holy places of Jerusalem, demanding privileges at shrines and monasteries. What seemed like theology was really strategy, a pretext to box out Russia and reassert France's grandeur after decades of humiliation. And in Vienna, Franz Joseph owed his very crown to Nicholas's bayonets. The Habsburg Emperor had survived 1848 only because Russian troops drowned Hungary's revolution in blood. It seemed natural that Austria would remain loyal to its northern ally, yet gratitude has a short life in empire. The price of Russian aid was high, and with Europe already shaping itself against St. Petersburg, loyalty could turn into isolation. Austrian ministers whispered that Nicholas's ambitions in the Balkans threatened Vienna as much as Istanbul. Within a few short years, Austria would be forced to choose between memory and interest, and whichever path it chose, it would make enemies either of Russia or of the rest of Europe. For Abdülmecid, the humiliation was acute. In his own palace, he was no longer seen as sovereign, but as a patient, examined, diagnosed, and prescribed to by foreign doctors who all disagreed on the cure. To his subjects, the insult, sick man, began to feel true. Every bayou to Europe confirmed that their sultan no longer stood above the powers. He bowed among them. No longer an empire of half a millennium, but Europe's plaything. Yet Ottoman weakness remained too valuable to waste. European bankers extended credit, underwriting the empire's fragile reforms. European officers advised its armies, and European engineers drew plans for new rails and ports. To London and Paris, the Tanzimat was not a sovereign program, it was leverage. The empire's arteries were already being mapped, with thoughts of who would inherit them when the sick man finally expired. The Suez, still just a dream, gleamed in their imagination. By 1852, the Black Sea had become a stage for the empire's fragility. The Ottoman fleet, still reeling from decades of reconstruction and reliant on European advisors, patrolled waters that Russia now eyed with ambition. Fortresses at Sevastopol and along the Danube Delta strengthened Nicholas I's hand, while British and French observers lingered in the wings, ready to blockade or pressure should Russian moves threaten the straits. Istanbul's control over the Bosporus and Dardanelles, once a symbol of imperial sovereignty, now felt more like a fragile promise than a reality. Financial dependence deepened the vulnerability. Loans floated through Galata banks to fund naval repairs, fortifications, and new steam frigates, all under the watchful gaze of British financiers. Every piastre spent on ships or garrisons tied the empire closer to European oversight. The Tanzimat's dream of law and reform had modernized bureaucracy, but its wealth had been mortgaged to maintain the very defenses meant to protect the state. Diplomacy further complicated matters. Abdülmecid remembered the promise made by Mahmud II to Nicholas I, alongside the guarantee of safeguarding the Black Sea against Russia's enemies, that the Ottomans would safeguard Orthodox subjects, a promise now recalled in St. Petersburg to justify interference. Across Europe, France and Britain maneuvered to keep the Ottoman corpse breathing, each exploiting instability to secure influence over the straits, trade routes, and the ever-coveted access to the Mediterranean and Suez. With the Ottoman army stretched thin, provinces simmering with unrest, and European powers circling like predators, Abdülmecid faced a terrifying calculus. Every move toward reform or defense risked provoking rebellion at home or intervention abroad. The empire's sovereignty was a tightrope, and the winds of Europe's politics were already gusting toward storm. And then came the spark. In Jerusalem, Orthodox and Catholic monks brawled over the keys to the Church of the Nativity, a quarrel of candles and doorways that spiraled into a diplomatic crisis. Nicholas pressed his claims, Napoleon III demanded his own, and the Ottoman Sultan, nominally Caliph of Islam, found himself reduced to caretaker of Europe's holy disputes. The quarrel over holy places was a pretext, but it was enough. By 1853, Russian armies massed on the Danube, and Europe's great powers circled closer than ever. Abdülmecid had endured rebellions and insults, but now he faced something greater, the prospect of war among the empires themselves, with Ottoman soil as the battlefield and the empire's survival hanging by a thread. When Nicholas I sent his armies across the Danube in 1853, it seemed the Ottomans faced certain ruin. Russian troops marched into Moldavia and Wallachia, demanding that Abdülmecid grant him full protection rights over Orthodox Christians. For Istanbul, the demand was submission in all but name. The Sultan refused, and the Russian bear began to feast on the Balkans. But Abdülmecid was not alone. Britain and France, alarmed at Russia's ambitions, declared that the Ottoman Empire must be defended. Lord Palmerston in London feared the Russian fleet in the Mediterranean would soon menace India. Napoleon III in Paris saw a chance to match the glories of his uncle and place France at the heart of Europe again. Their ships and soldiers poured into the Bosporus. Their flags flew alongside the Sultans. And for a fleeting moment, Abdülmecid stood as the equal of Europe's emperors, the recognition he had dreamed of since boyhood. The war's first great clash came at sea. In November 1853, Russian ships annihilated an Ottoman squadron at Sinop, burning men alive in their wooden hulks. Europe erupted in outrage. For Britain and France, Sinope was proof that Russia meant to dominate the Black Sea. In 1854, they declared war, and the Eastern question turned from diplomacy into battle. British and French soldiers landed in Crimea, laying siege to Sevastopol. Sardinia even sent troops eager for a seat at the peace table. Austria occupied the Danubian provinces, blocking Russia's advance, yet never joined the war. Ottoman forces bled too at battles like Silistra and Eupatoria, but in every campaign it was clear, success relied on European firepower and funding. French cannons, British steamships and foreign loans carried the war. The Crimean War was less a contest of cannon than of cholera. Disease killed far more men than cannons or musket. Russian and British camps lost half their strength to typhus and dysentery. French regiments wasted away in the mud, and Ottoman battalions sent to the front with poor supplies were ravaged by plague. Hospitals became charnel houses until Florence Nightingale's reforms brought order to the British wards, while Ottoman soldiers, lacking their own lady with the lamp, often died unseen. In the end, the war's deadliest enemy was not Nicholas's armies, but the filth, hunger, and sickness that consumed them all. The cost was staggering. To keep pace, Abdülmecid's government turned even more to the Galata bankers and European creditors, mortgaging more future revenues for present survival. Steam frigates were ordered on British credit, rifles on French loans. The war was paid for in debt, debts that would never be escaped. The siege of Sevastopol became the war's grim centerpiece. For a year, British, French, Sardinian, and Ottoman troops battered Russia's great naval base on the Black Sea. Trenches stretched for miles, entire battalions rotted in the mud, while Ottoman soldiers, often overlooked, fought in the same filth and endured the same hunger. The fall of Sevastopol in 1855 was hailed as Europe's victory. After 3 years of carnage, Sevastopol fell, Nicholas I died, and his heir Alexander II sued for peace. The war had cost 500,000 lives on both sides, many of them Ottoman subjects conscripted into a war decided in foreign capitals. At the Congress of Paris in 1856, the Sultan's diplomats sat at the same table as Britain, France, and Russia, for the first time treated as formal equals. The treaty declared the empire's sovereignty guaranteed by Europe, the Black Sea neutralized, Russian warships banished, and Ottoman Christians under international protection. But behind the triumph lay humiliation. Every clause that proclaimed sovereignty also advertised dependence. Ottoman rights were no longer self-evident. They were gifts bestowed by the powers that had saved the empire. Abdülmecid entered the hall as the triumphant sultan who had stood against the bear and lived. And for a moment, the applause felt real, even if measured in loans and foreign generals' deeds. But the victory was hollow. The empire had survived only by drowning in debt, borrowing soldiers as much as money. The British and French had not fought for Istanbul. They had fought for their own sea lanes, for India, for glory. Abdülmecid's laurels were borrowed ones, his empire's lifeline purchased at a price that would never stop rising. For the ordinary Ottoman soldier, the Crimean War was not glory, but exhaustion. Anatolian peasants were marched north with little pay and poor rations, often serving under foreign officers who barely spoke their tongue. They fought bravely at Silistra, at Eupatoria, even in the trenches before Sevastopol, but their role was overshadowed by British and French armies who claimed the laurels. The empire's dead were buried under foreign banners, their sacrifice another reminder that Ottoman victories were no longer Ottoman alone. To his people, the war revealed an empire unable to stand alone. To his creditors, it marked the beginning of permanent oversight, and to his enemies, it confirmed the truth Nicholas had spoken. The Ottoman Empire was still sick, only now sustained on European medicine. The war ended with parades and treaties. The Sultan could proclaim victory. Russia humbled, the Black Sea neutralized, the empire saved. But in the silence after the cannon, Abdülmecid felt only emptiness as he received hollow cheers. His empire had survived not through strength, but through loans, through allies who mocked him, and through soldiers who were not his own. Victory had stripped him of more than defeat might have. It bound his empire to Europe's banks, Europe's generals, Europe's mercy. Yet even as he nursed this humiliation, another stage was opening. Far from the Black Sea, famine stalked Ireland, and millions starved under Europe's gaze. It would be here, not with fleets or cannon, that Abdülmecid would surprise the world. Ireland was starving. The Great Famine had turned the Emerald Isle into a landscape of despair, fields left fallow, villages emptied, children dying of hunger and disease. News of the suffering crossed the seas, reaching Istanbul in French newspapers and diplomatic dispatches. For the Sultan and his ministers, it was impossible to ignore. Millions dying mere miles away, while Europe flaunted its wealth on foreign battlefields instead of relief. In the Ottoman court, discussion of the famine quickly became a matter of conscience and diplomacy. Some advisors cautioned restraint. Britain would see any intervention as interference, they warned, and resources were already stretched thin. Yet Abdülmecid, moved by reports and by his own moral compass, insisted on action. Funds were allocated, grain gathered, and ships loaded for Dublin. Letters accompanied the cargo, affirming not only aid, but solidarity. In a world where diplomacy was measured in cannon fire, the Sultan was sending mercy. Even as the empire staggered under debt, disease, and rebellion, Abdülmecid could not turn away from suffering. Memories of his mother's teachings, that a ruler's strength was measured as much in mercy as in armies, guided his hand. While Europe hesitated, unwilling to upset the delicate balance of power, the Sultan acted. Ships carried grain, funds flowed from Istanbul, and relief was dispatched to the starving in Ireland, a Catholic nation abandoned by fellow Christian states. In doing so, Abdülmecid drew on centuries of Islamic tradition, where zakat and charitable giving were sacred duties, and mercy toward the suffering transcended borders. Even the sick man of Europe could show a kind of strength that did not rely on cannon or coin, a quiet, enduring, moral authority. In these acts, the Sultan's humanity outshone the pragmatism and self-interest of far more powerful empires.
But the gesture did not go unchallenged. British authorities, furious at a foreign monarch delivering aid to their domestic crisis, imposed blockades and delays at ports. Ships carrying Ottoman grain were held in harbours, inspected and taxed, forcing captains to negotiate with officials who treated them with suspicion, even hostility. Letters from Dublin described frustrated merchants, rotting cargo, and anxious local leaders desperately awaiting relief that seemed perpetually stalled. The Sultan's kindness was being slowed, obstructed, and weaponized as a point of political leverage. Despite the blockade, Ottoman diplomats pressed for delivery. Envoys in London and Dublin argued relentlessly, invoking humanitarian need and international sympathy. Meanwhile, the Sultan's ships navigated British bureaucracy with care, leveraging French and neutral ports to bypass delays when possible. Grain arrived piecemeal, funds trickled through, and though the blockade slowed the aid, it could not entirely stop it. Every successful delivery was a quiet victory over the political power trying to suppress it. For the Irish, the Ottoman aid became a lifeline, even if delayed. Many, including Archbishop Paul Cullen, publicly thanked Abdulmajid and the empire for such generosity. Grain and funds fed thousands, supporting local relief committees and allowing hospitals to treat the starving. The gesture was noticed far beyond Ireland. Newspapers in France, the Ottoman Empire, and parts of Europe hailed the Sultan's action as moral leadership. A Muslim monarch had acted decisively where the British Empire had faltered, turning the tide of despair, even if only in fragments. Yet the episode underscored the limits of power. Abdulmajid could act with principle, but he could not compel compliance from Britain. Geography, politics, and the empire's dependencies still constrained his influence. His ability to feed distant people highlighted his moral vision, but it did little to secure the empire itself. Even as Ireland's starving children were fed, Abdulmajid could not escape the reality at home. The coffers were fragile, the provinces unrestful, and European eyes everywhere. Yet in that moment, a sultan who had weathered cannon, disease, and diplomacy chose generosity over calculation, compassion over convenience. His gift crossed seas and faiths, a quiet declaration that even the sick man of Europe could act with moral authority. But charity cannot pay debts, and kindness cannot fill treasuries. As Europe cheered or seethed, Ottoman coffers would soon be pried open in another currency, loans, credit, and contracts that would shape the empire far more than any fleet or edict. The stage was set. The next battle would not be fought with muskets, but with numbers on a ledger, and the Sultan would once again face the cost of survival in a world where even victory could enslave.
Even as the cannons fell silent and the treaties were signed in Paris, the vultures circled. European banks poured into Istanbul, offering loans for railways, telegraphs, and modern ministries. At first, these were hailed as instruments of progress. The Rumelia Railway Company laid its first tracks, telegraph lines blinked across the empire, ministries were rebuilt with European expertise. But every contract, every copper wire, every rail tie was tied to a foreign ledger. Creditors demanded interest, advisors demanded oversight, and with each payment, Ottoman sovereignty slipped further from the Sultan's hands. Galata bankers, men like Isaac Mendes and other European-affiliated houses, became the hidden engines of empire. Baring Brothers in London financed steamships. Parisian firms underwrote railways and ports. Every new project came with invisible strings. Ottoman officials discovered that ministries staffed by European advisors now dictated policy as often as Istanbul did. Reform was no longer a matter of choice. It was a debt-driven choreography written in Paris, London, and Vienna, performed in the palaces and ports of the Ottoman Empire. With each successive loan, the empire mortgaged not just its present, but its future. Revenues from provincial taxes, collected from Anatolia, Rumelia, and the Levant, were earmarked to satisfy European creditors, leaving local administrators scrambling to fund roads, garrisons, and relief for famine or unrest. Villages saw levies rise, harvests shrink under the weight of debt, and governors whispered that the empire's lifeblood had been pledged abroad before it could serve its own people. Every reform, every telegraph, every steamship carried a hidden cost. The very provinces that sustained the empire were now underwriting its subservience. Abdülmecid watched as modernization became bondage. Telegraphs linked Istanbul to the provinces, but each message carried the eyes of foreign engineers and creditors. Railways spread toward the interior, carrying goods, armies and observers alike. Infrastructure meant to strengthen the empire now mapped its dependencies. The Sultan realized painfully that while the empire appeared to grow, its true strength was being quietly drained. And then came the Suez. By 1859, plans were already underway to dig a canal linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, a waterway that promised to transform global trade. Europe's engineers and financiers loomed over the project, their contracts and loans shaping every mile of progress. All infrastructure, from ports to railways, became part of a larger design, a quiet claim on the empire's arteries long before a single ship sailed the Suez. The Suez would not just shorten voyages, it would crystallize Ottoman dependency, a monument to borrowed power, built with the empire's own consent. Abdülmecid, who had once believed in the promise of reform, now faced the cold calculus of survival. Every telegraph, rail, and ministry expansion reminded him that sovereignty could be mortgaged as easily as debt. Every European credit, however well-intentioned, edged the empire closer to a reality where modernity would arrive dressed in chains. The empire was modern on paper, but weakened at its core. Every new project was a rehearsal for foreign control, every borrowed lira a testament to Europe's foresight and the Sultan's constrained authority. In this new age of debt, the Sultan remained the master in name only. European banks dictated the rhythm of treasury payments, foreign advisors shaped policy, and Istanbul's coffers emptied to satisfy interests that enriched distant capitals. Abdülmecid understood that survival was temporary and the empire's dependence was permanent. His realm had been saved from collapse once, but now the price of life was bondage. The Suez loomed not as a marvel, but as a reckoning. Every stone, every canal contract, every foreign engineer at work on the banks whispered the same truth. Europe had planned for this, and the empire's modernity had been the vehicle for its own containment. The Ottoman Empire could no longer claim independence. Even triumph in reform had become a gilded cage.
By the late 1850s, the empire's pulse had slowed. Reform no longer carried the audacity of Mahmud II or the early years of Tanzimat. It had become a shadow, a list of regulations and committees that dazzled Europe but accomplished little at home. Ministries ran with European oversight. Provincial governors whispered that revenues were pledged before collection, and corruption seeped through the veins of every bureaucracy. The Ottoman state, once vibrant, now seemed a gilded machine, impressive in appearance but brittle beneath the surface. Ministries and infrastructure projects gleamed with European expertise. Telegraphs connected Istanbul to the provinces. Railways carried goods and troops, yet every advancement was shadowed by foreign oversight. Creditors dictated budgets, provincial taxes were pledged to repay loans, and corruption flourished where reform once promised renewal. The Tanzimat, once bold and visionary, now felt like a costume worn for European eyes. Abdülmecid, aged only 36, weakened by years of illness and the constant burden of debt, retreated further into the palace. His body, worn by chronic ailments and the toll of stress, grew frail. Reports suggest he suffered from tuberculosis like Mahmud, as well as potential kidney disease and complications from gout. Compounded by exhaustion, and the relentless strain of governance. He rarely left his chambers. Audiences were brief, meals small, and even familiar faces were kept at a distance. The Sultan watched helplessly as the empire he had labored to modernize grew dependent, centralized, and yet increasingly hollow. European financiers observed every signature. The grand vision he had once carried in his heart, a modern sovereign Ottoman Empire, now felt like a costume, worn for Europe's applause rather than for his people. Every telegraph line, every railway, every port project reminded him that modernity had arrived dressed in chains. Europe had dug itself deep into the Ottoman system. Creditors dictated the pace of reform, advisors oversaw spending, and the empire's coffers emptied to satisfy interest in London and Paris. The Tanzimat, once a bold statement of reform, had become a carefully choreographed performance. Progress for Europe's benefit, dependency for Istanbul's. Abdülmecid watched from his chambers as his empire modernized, centralized, and yet hollowed. A sovereign in name, a servant in practice. Even as Europe praised him, the Sultan knew the truth. Admiration could not pay debts. Applause could not restore authority, and reforms could not secure sovereignty. The empire's arteries, ports, railways, telegraphs were mapped not for Ottoman strength but for European leverage. Every new project, every borrowed lira reminded him that survival had become bondage. And yet, even in weakness, Abdülmecid carried the dignity of his office. Diplomats still treated him with respect. Foreign courts applauded his reforms and charity. The charitable Sultan remained to the outside world a European monarch. But inside the palace he knew the truth. Respect could not override debt, applause could not substitute for sovereignty, and admiration could not protect the empire from itself. On June 25, 1861, Abdülmecid passed away quietly in the Dolmabahce Palace, surrounded by a few ministers and family. His death, the result of chronic illness compounded by exhaustion, marked the end of an era. The first sultan to rule in the full glare of European scrutiny, the first to reconcile the ideals of reform with the harsh reality of dependence. Tributes poured in from foreign courts. Ambassadors praised his vision. Diplomats lauded his moderation. Yet within Istanbul, the echo was different, a reminder that the empire had modernized not entirely by choice, but under compulsion, and that the Sultan's legacy was as constrained as it was celebrated. Abdülmecid's passing closed a chapter of ambitious reform, moral courage, and carefully measured diplomacy. It left behind an empire more modern and centralized, yet increasingly beholden to foreign powers. The road to Europe's control of Egypt and Suez had been paved, the ledger books balanced in foreign capitals, and the next sultan, Abdulaziz, was poised to inherit both the progress and the bondage.
Abdülmecid I died as he had lived, reaching for something just beyond his grasp. The Tanzimat was real, the reforms were real. The dream that an empire 6 centuries old could remake itself from the inside, that was real too. But empires don't run on dreams alone. They run on money, on loyalty, on the willingness of men in distant provinces to still believe the throne is worth following. Abdülmecid spent his reign asking them to believe, and for a time they did. The sultans who followed would inherit everything their predecessors had built, and every debt they had left unpaid. Progress and bondage, wound so tightly together that no man alive could separate them. What came next was not a continuation of the dream. It was its long and painful unraveling through corruption, through blood, and through a throne that history would leave with nothing left to rule. That story is the long betrayal. And it continues on road to destruction, the world wars.